Hi, I'm David Shipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Two reporters. Start now. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Danny. How are you doing?
Great, thanks. And here's our mission today. We're going to find out, why can't anybody seem to do anything about Donald Trump's corruption? I mean, it is mind-boggling.
And it's not like the President of the United States hides his potential conflicts of interest. Media reports estimate that he and his family have made perhaps billions of dollars from deals that they've concluded or in process just since he took office. And they brag about them publicly.
Yeah, cryptocurrency, mega real estate deals in foreign countries.
We'll describe some of those deals in a bit. But first, let's welcome our guest. He's one of America's best specialists on government ethics and on the lack of them. Walter Shaub, welcome.
Hey there.
And Walter Shaub, Are we accurate when we say there is not one single law that really prohibits the flagrant business deals that President Trump has been making for him and his family? I mean, no law that prohibits the potential conflicts of interest?
No, there is none, because although there are two laws that would apply to him, the Supreme Court is not going to allow them to be enforced. Really, the only laws of any sort that applied to the president were the emoluments clause of the United States Constitution and the bribery statute.
Emoluments meaning people giving gifts to the president.
Right. The suits over the emoluments clause failed in his first term. As for that second one, the bribery statute, the Supreme Court said that as long as he's acting in his core presidential responsibilities, he can't break any criminal laws. So we're in a law-free zone. We're truly in a law-free zone when it comes to the president now.
Unbelievable. But I say unbelievable about 100 times a day now.
So, Walter Shaub, let's introduce you more fully. President Obama appointed you to run the United States Office of Government Ethics, which you began to do in 2013. It is part of the executive branch. And then you worked through that administration and resigned 4 years later, not long after President Trump began his first term. But you continued to work on ethics issues with various public interest groups. Is that all pretty much the right story?
Yes.
Then a few months ago, you sent an email to dozens of journalism types and others who cover these issues, and you basically said, and forgive me, I'm paraphrasing you here, folks, I can't keep working like this on ethics issues anymore. I'm fried. Can you please read part of that email?
Sure. It was really intended as an apology because the requests from reporters were coming in faster than I could respond, and they were all on the topic of government ethics. And here's how I explained it. I said my focus has largely shifted away from government ethics for one simple reason. There's nothing resembling government ethics left in the United States government. The current administration has shattered all semblance of government integrity in the federal executive branch, both with its unprecedented firing of the director of the Office of Government Ethics and with the shocking misconduct of the president and his appointees. Congress has failed to ban its members from trading stocks. The Supreme Court's justices have accepted gifts, failed to refuse from cases when needed, and hawked books for personal profit. To say only the wreckage of a government ethics program exists would be to exaggerate what has survived. There remain only dust and ashes of a program that, while never strong enough, represented a genuine effort to instill trust in government. There is no basis for any trust in the United States government at this point. It would be a mistake to treat the current threat as anything less than a fascist movement that seeks to emulate the corrupt leaders of countries like Hungary and eventually Russia. Dissent has already become risky and in some cases dangerous. That is the true measure of how far we've backslid as a democracy.
Wow.
Well, let me pick up on something you said in this email. I certainly personally do not disagree with your very bleak picture. But on the ethics question, I understand that, that the description that you give pertains to the various highest levels, the president and many of his cabinet members. But down in the agencies, I understand, ethics training still takes place by lawyers who are, assigned to do that. And that officials are observing many of these rules. Many of them are by regulation about conflicts of interest. So let's slice this a little more thinly. What do you see as the variations in the ethical landscape here from top to bottom?
Yeah, it's like pouring a little slimy oil into a glass of water. They're not going to mix, and there'll be the layer of oil where nothing is working right. And then in the water, things are still going pretty well. The government ethics rules do not work at the political level, and they work pretty well at the career level of government official, which means that the people with the most power to do harm are covered by the least restrictive rules, or at least the rules are enforced the least with respect to them. And the people lower, we know the system's working because you haven't had to pay a bribe to get a passport. You don't get a federal shakedown with agents who are underpaid and under-monitored demanding money from you at impromptu, road stops like in other countries where there's no kind of order at the lower levels. One of the problems, though, is I don't think that situation's going to stand. It has always been true that your lowest level, entry-level employee, the one who in the olden days would have made photocopies and today would have done whatever the modern equivalent of that is, maybe scan documents, is held to a higher ethical standard than either the president or the Chief Justice of the United States of America.
And these are the civil servants you're talking about who Trump and his allies condemn as this deep state.
Yeah, and it's actually why I shifted my focus to the civil service, because at this point, the corruption is unlike in his first administration. Not that his first administration wasn't corrupt, but they did some effort to hide it. And that also then limited some of the things they were willing to do. It's out in the open this time, and he's not even pretending to have set up a fake blind trust or any of the things that he claimed he was doing and really wasn't last time. I've always viewed the civil service protections for federal employees as one of the most important government ethics protections we have. It enables them to refuse to comply with unlawful orders. It enables them to hold their jobs when they tell the truth about science or other failures, other issues that the administration cares about. We just saw the president fire the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because he didn't like the statistics.
Yeah.
Now, she was a political appointee, but you strip the protections from career employees, and they can't even tell the truth to the political appointees without being fired. And we're already seeing agencies like the Department of Justice just summarily firing employees and ignoring the civil service laws, claiming Article 2 of the Constitution, which is the section that addresses the presidency, gives the president all kinds of magical powers that aren't spelled out in the Constitution but allow him to ignore laws. And so that's why I see the dismantling of the civil service and civil service protections as possibly the greatest ethics threat, even beyond the open corruption, because it's intended to enable the president and presidential appointees to misuse governmental power in ways that a loyal, law-abiding career civil service might prevent or slow.
Well, one thing we want to ask you about is your personal background. What is it about your family, your parents, a teacher when you were a kid, who got you passionate about the idea of morality and telling the truth and being transparent?
Well, first of all, I would never hold myself out as a paragon of morality, and I have plenty to regret in life, just like anyone else. But my interest in government ethics comes from my strong, abiding interest in public service. I grew up in a suburb of Washington, D.C. My father worked for the federal government. Our neighbors worked for the federal government. The kids in school, their parents mostly worked for the federal government. At that time especially, this was a company town. People moved here to go work for the government in large part. And what I saw was a level of patriotism and dedication to serving their country. And the culture inside the government, once I got there, proved to be consistent with that. They don't necessarily put their lives on the line on a battlefield the way the soldiers do. So I don't want to make a false equivalency, but they truly do feel they are serving their country, and they are driven by a patriotic desire to serve their country. So these attacks on them as some kind of mythical deep state are just repugnant, because what they're guilty of is caring about the American people, the Constitution, and the laws that Congress passes.
And how does that then translate into your professional interest? I mean, you became a lawyer. You obviously with a law degree, you could do lots of different things. What drew you to the ethical question particularly?
Sure. I started in a pretty mundane job as an attorney in an agency's general counsel's office. One of the nice things about that when you're young is if you're interested, there are lots of opportunities to dabble in a wide range of areas of the law and types of work. And I seized those at every opportunity. And it's part of why until this administration, I preached the idea of going into public service, because not only are you waking up in the past feeling like you're going to work for an organization that's trying to help the country, and you may disagree with whoever's the president at the time, but as long as they're loyal to the concept of democracy, as were President Obama, President Bush, President Clinton, the other President Bush, President Reagan, Carter, you were still there to just do the day-to-day work of government, and they could figure out the policy issues, but within the parameters they set for the policy issues, you got to work every day to try to make your country better. And one decision led to another, and I found that the ethics work really resonated with my belief in public service and keeping public service as pure as possible without conflicts of interest. And the name Office of Government Ethics is a little bit of a misnomer because it doesn't sit in judgment of all ethical things. The director of the Office of Government Ethics doesn't get to say, hey, both parties in Congress and in the White House, I think maybe invading Iraq is wrong. I don't get to say that if I'm in that role. But you do get to say, hey, Secretary of Commerce, you holding on to this investment that's going to be affected by the programs of your agency is wrong, and you need to divest that, get rid of it. And so it felt like within a very large structure, it was a fairly narrow role, but an important one. And I just got more and more drawn to it over the years.
Did you see problems that you thought needed to be addressed?
Interestingly, what drew me was the successes. Again, as I gave the example, I'm pleased that you don't live in a country, or didn't at least, in a country where you had to worry that your application for benefits was going to be slowed if you were of the wrong political party, or if you didn't pay off the processor, or if you didn't in some way flatter them or help them. I mean, this was a very professional workforce, and contrary to what Trump is selling to the world, a truly apolitical workforce. I've now worked in the private sector and in nonprofits, and I was shocked by the culture change when I came out of the government and people freely talked about politics in the workplace. That doesn't happen in the federal workplace. People don't talk politics, and I didn't know who most of my coworkers voted for.
Dave and I, as journalists over decades, of course, have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people in the government. Many of our friends work for the federal government. So everything you're saying rings true to me. I'm sure to Dave, too.
Absolutely, yeah.
And one thing that interested me when I was doing a little research for our chat today is I went back to the founding fathers, right? We're always supposed to do that. And they were writing about the dangers of corruption. Alexander Hamilton wrote, "Nothing was more to be desired than that every practicable obstacle should be opposed to cabal, intrigue, and corruption." John Adams wrote, "Because power corrupts, society's demands for moral authority and character increase as the importance of the position increases." George Washington warned against The real estate deals, which we're going to talk about in a moment with President Trump, he said, against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake.
I'm sorry.
George Washington got your dog all inspired.
She did.
When was the first time really that the U.S., that the Congress or somebody, started to take corruption seriously and pass laws about it?
The very first corruption law in our country was the Emoluments Clause of the United States Constitution. So the founders themselves baked into the structure of this country the idea that a president shouldn't be influenced by taking gifts or other benefits from foreign countries. There's actually two parts to the Emoluments Clause, because the same is true of anything from states within the country.
Meaning what? The states also can't give gifts to the president?
Emoluments. That's right.
And then I read that during the Civil War, Congress passed a law specifically saying, hey, government officials, you can't have financial conflicts of interest, right?
And that was a response to some real corruption problems during the Civil War, particularly with government procurement, which sounds like a very dull bureaucratic thing, but when it prolongs a war because you're having procurement problems, the country suffered enormously from corruption in the 19th century, partly due to the lack of laws directly addressing corruption, and partly due to the lack of a professional, merit-based civil service as opposed to a politically based one.
And Dave, when you were in school, did you study the Teapot Dome scandal?
Teapot Dome scandal? Yeah, sure I did, but I can't remember a thing about it.
Well, I looked it up to remember, and in the early 1920s, this was like the big scandal in the 20th century. President Harding's Interior Secretary took bribes and gave leases without any kind of bidding to two oil company people, leases to Federal Oil. Anyway, the Interior Secretary went to jail. So that's what I remember from history about corruption.
So the first real wave of government ethics laws being passed was in the wake of the Civil War, as you mentioned. And then over the next century, there were tweaks here and there, minor tweaks, some of which followed the Teapot Dome scandal. But the next major effort to overhaul government ethics laws came in 1962, where Congress reorganized a smattering and patchwork of conflict of interest laws into one chapter of the criminal code. And then the next wave came in the wake of the Nixon scandals, and in 1978 they passed the Ethics in Government Act, which among other things created the Office of Government Ethics. And I just want to point out that none of those reforms, and there were many in 1978, including not just the Ethics in Government Act, but the Inspector General Act, the Presidential Records Act, the Civil Service Reform Act, and others, none of that would have stopped what Nixon did. But it was an effort to shift the culture of the executive branch and to create new norms. But a norm, in many ways, is actually more powerful than a law because it's an expectation of the public.
That's very interesting. What a good point. Yeah.
And that's why up until Trump, every president tried to avoid criminal conflicts of interest scandals, less serious scandals, and even the appearance that they had conflicts of interest. If the public cares enough about that norm, that will end a political career. And somehow Trump has managed to not only defeat the laws, which is the easiest part of it when you have a supermajority of hyper-partisan politicians wearing robes in the Supreme Court, and you have Pam Bondi as your attorney general, but he's also blown through the norms because he's created a populist movement where his followers don't really care about corruption. Either they've been persuaded that the government was always this corrupt, which it was not, or that who cares if it's corrupt if he's doing the things we like. And now the country's so polarized, nobody's going to switch what party they vote for because they don't feel their candidate is clean enough. I still hold that a norm is stronger than a law at that level of government, But unfortunately, both laws and norms have been crushed now.
Well, that's really a fascinating point because I've been realizing, I guess we were all realizing, how voluntary our constitutional system is in terms of its compliance, you know? It's like driving down the street and it's a matter of trust. You expect the fellow coming the other way is going to also drive on the right-hand side of the road and observe the red lights, even if there are no cops around.
As we talked about before, there's order and structure for everybody else. But the elected officials and the Supreme Court justices just don't care about accountability to the American people at all. And they don't hold themselves accountable.
And the Supreme Court wrote about ethics in a 1961 decision, right? Over 65 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled, quote, "A democracy is effective only if the people have faith in those who govern. And the faith is bound to be shattered when high officials engage in activities which arouse suspicions of malfeasance and corruption."
They're talking about norms. They're talking about norms there.
And in a moment, we want to talk about some of the new norms that Trump seems to be establishing, which is the notion that it's fine for the president and his family to make personal business deals that seem intertwined with his job as president.
But first, let's go over the ethics laws in a little more detail, please, because they can get really complicated, and we want to keep them clear. First of all, as you said at the beginning, the Constitution says that presidents and vice presidents should not accept gifts from foreign governments or states, right? That's the so-called emoluments clause. And in theory, Congress could impeach a president for violating that.
Right.
And then in the early 1960s, Congress passed a law saying that officials in the executive branch, including the president, cannot take bribes. And if you get convicted, you could go to prison. But, a big but, both of those laws have basically become irrelevant when it comes to Trump because the Supreme Court ruled last year that presidents are immune from prosecution for just about any crime that they commit while performing their official duties as president.
So if somebody's paying you to go invade Venezuela, ordering the military to do stuff is your core responsibility as a president. So go ahead and take that bribe. The Supreme Court says it's just fine.
Congress also passed laws saying that officials in the executive branch can't have conflicts of interest. They basically can't take part in deliberations and decisions that will benefit them financially, except Congress specifically said that these conflict of interest laws do not apply to the president and vice president, who are exempt.
Which seems crazy. What's up with that?
I think the rationale, to the extent there was one, other than each party didn't want their guy to be embarrassed when they were serving as president, which was probably the primary motivator, is that the president is involved in so many things that it would be impossible to eliminate all conflicts of interest, because even adjusting financial policy could affect something as simple as a bank account. And there's many things that could affect even non-controversial diversified mutual funds, which nobody's going to worry about being a conflict, but the president could affect those things.
Because you don't know what specific stocks the mutual funds hold. Is that right?
Right. Now, what they could have done is banned some things and settled for imperfect, but they tried nothing whatsoever and then ran out of ideas.
And just to remind everybody what Dave said at the beginning, you were running the Office of Government Ethics at the beginning of President Trump's first term in 2017.
I did.
And you were so outraged by what he was doing and not doing that you spoke out publicly, which was very unusual.
Within hours of his election night victory, there were demands to know how the president-elect would separate his work from the White House. A week later, this picture, Trump meeting with the Indian developers of 2 Trump towers in their country. The Trumps
and we have your speech. Let's hear an excerpt.
I wish circumstances were different and I didn't feel the need to make public remarks today. You don't hear about ethics when things are going well. You've been hearing a lot about ethics lately. I need to talk about ethics.
And let's jump ahead in your speech just a bit.
Since then, Presidents Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama all either established blind trusts or limited their investments to non-conflicting assets.
But of course, Trump kept resisting doing what all those presidents before him had done. Walt, that was pretty brave of you to give that speech about your boss, who was the president.
I made the decision to do it after he announced his fake blind trust. And what I pointed out is that the president has the power to send our troops overseas and potentially die in foreign conflicts. And if you have the power to cause the death of American soldiers who are sacrificing their lives for their country, I don't think it's too much to ask that you be a little inconvenienced by divesting your conflicting financial interests if you want to be the president of the United States of America.
And you resigned. You were not fired, just for the record.
You know, despite my clashes with the Trump administration, they never fired me in the first term. This year, Trump fired the director of the Office of Government Ethics and then kept appointing a succession of acting directors. And so as of the final week of August 2025, the Office of Government Ethics has now had 4 directors in 7 months.
It's a good time to turn to Trump, but first I just want to remind our listeners that we're speaking with Walter Shaub, who headed the Office of Government Ethics, appointed by President Obama and carried on into a bit of the first Trump administration.
So, Walt, let's start off by talking about Trump's real estate deals. We're just going to touch on a few of them. But I think the details really are important to hear, to try to wrap your mind around this, that this is the President of the United States and his family doing this. In Oman, for instance, and this comes from CREW, which you worked with for a while, the
Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington.
So CREW's reporting summarizes that in Oman, there is a Trump hotel, golf course, and residences being developed on land that the government of Oman owns. In Serbia, the Trump family is also building a Trump International Hotel on government-owned land. By the way, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, is a big part of that deal too. And that whole development in Serbia has become a controversial political issue. I mean, there have been massive street protests against Serbia's president for months, alleging that he's, becoming an authoritarian.
And evidence earlier this year suggested that the Serbian government was attacking protesters with high-tech acoustic weapons, which Serbia's president denied.
The prohibited device admits a burst of incredibly loud sound to temporarily incapacitate people. Now, Serbia has been gripped by months of protests triggered by the collapse of a train.
And who should show up to meet with Serbia's president and publicly praise him in the midst of all this violence? Donald Trump Jr. By the way, a spokesman for Trump Jr. said that he was there merely to interview Serbia's president for his podcast. It had nothing to do with politics or Trump's real estate deals. Any comments, Walt?
I think it's important to point out that with each of these deals, and especially if it brings Trump or his family members in person to praise the leader,
who's under attack by massive street protests,
and giving them massive credibility and the appearance of the backing of the United States, that puts pressure on other countries to come up with ways to benefit Trump. When one country gives a brand new airplane to Trump and another gives a land deal to Trump. So imagine if you're an Eastern European country staring down the barrel of Russian aggression and wondering if you're next after Ukraine, and you have something of value to give President Trump. You're going to feel a lot of pressure to do it. Or maybe, we can go through any list of countries that would like.
Well, let me mention Qatar again. Because one of Trump's other Middle East projects is the Trump International Golf Club and Villas in Qatar, near the capital Doha. It's part of a multi-billion-dollar luxury beachside resort, and the company that's managing that development is owned by the Qatari government's investment fund. In 2 weeks, After the Trump Organization announced this deal,
Barnett, we want to show you some fresh video just into our newsroom moments ago. You're looking at President Trump deplaning after touching down in Doha, Qatar. This is stop 2 on his trip through the Middle East. There's a lot of interest in this visit following Qatar's controversial offer to donate a jumbo jet for.
And then the United Arab Emirates just made a massive investment in a business connected to Trump and his sons. And that's a country that the United States has always had significant concerns about human rights violations. But what a way to buy your way out of criticism from the United States and stay in the good graces of the current president.
Are there examples where these real estate deals have actually affected U.S. policy? I mean, I assume that the problem here is that the president will be acting in his own financial interest rather than in the foreign policy interest of the United States. I mean, that's an assumption, and it seems pretty obvious. But, I mean, can we connect the dots and show where the real estate interests or the desire to get permission to build and all of that have actually affected U.S. foreign policy? Trump is turning tariffs on and off. One has to wonder whether he's getting something from various countries in return in one form or another. I mean, I know he's just trying to throw his weight around and he thinks he's doing good for the U.S. economy, but is there a personal profit angle to this, do you think?
Unfortunately, a definitive, clear connection will always be impossible in any case unless a president writes a memoir saying, I only did this because of my own personal interest.
Well,
we really have no way of knowing. But what matters, and I think this is where the analysis starts and stops, is that he retained his conflicting financial interests. They make so much about, oh, well, he's not controlling these things. He's turned it over to his sons. Well, first of all, I don't believe that. But even if I did believe it, it's irrelevant. Who cares? He profits when the company does well and doesn't profit when the company does poorly. And he can make government decisions that will help his companies benefit. We shouldn't have to wonder if decisions about Turkey or Saudi Arabia are based on Trump's financial interests or the best interests of the American people. The thing is, the very idea of government ethics is to avoid citizens having to ask that question. The man runs around saying, America first. But what we have to wonder is it America first after him?
I guess another way you could put it would be that if we're looking for a quid pro quo, this for that, that really is pretty difficult to find.
Well, and countries, governments, and especially in particular parts of the world, but really any country, doesn't work that way. They don't say, we're going to give you this airplane or this land deal if you XYZ. When the first 3 countries give him something nice and then benefit, the next 3 countries are going to know that if they give him something nice, they'll benefit. And they don't need the quid pro quo. They will do it and it will happen in return. And then that brings them closer to the administration and they anticipate benefits. And he knows to reward them so that other countries will know that if they confer benefits on him, he'll reciprocate. Or if they don't, retaliate. And so there's never going to be an explicit quid pro quo because there doesn't need to be.
In the interest of fairness, we should quote the White House. The Guardian, excellent newspaper, asked the White House for comment when it was doing reporting on these mega real estate deals. And here was the White House answer, quote, there are no conflicts of interest. President Trump's assets are in a trust managed by his children. It is shameful that the Guardian is ignoring the good deals, and good is all in caps, the good deals President Trump has secured for the American people, not for himself to push a false narrative. President Trump only acts in the best interest of the American public, which is why they overwhelmingly reelected him to this office, despite years of lies and false accusations against him and his businesses from the fake news media, unquote.
My advice for that silly quote from the White House is to play the Benny Hill theme song in the background as you're reading it. because it's got about as much seriousness as that.
We'll see if we can rustle that up. Well, let's get to the cryptocurrency deals that Trump and his family have been making, because I think there, even though we don't have proof that it's affecting Trump's policy decisions for the whole country, I think there's clearer suggestions of it. Before we talk about crypto, Walt, can you give a 7th grade definition to the people who are befuddled by all of this?
I cannot.
Well, I'll tell you who can. ChatGPT. I looked this up. What is cryptocurrency? And I said, please explain it for 7th graders. Here's ChatGPT's take. Quote, cryptocurrency is like digital money you use on the internet. It's not printed like dollars or coins. It only exists online. It uses special computer codes to keep it safe and to make sure no one cheats. No banks or governments control it. People can use it to buy things or send money to others anywhere in the world, unquote. Bitcoin is the most famous kind. We've all heard of Bitcoins, but there's all kinds. And last year, just before the election, Trump's family helped start a cryptocurrency company called World Liberty Financial. Its business is to let customers borrow and lend cryptocurrency and manage their cryptocurrency, sort of, I think, a little bit like a cryptocurrency bank.
So the Trump family owns a majority of World Liberty, and they get the majority of the sales. And after Donald Trump moved into the White House, one of his first executive orders was to get the U.S. Treasury to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve and a, quote, digital asset stockpile. So now the U.S. government officially invests in cryptocurrency and blesses it, which financial analysts say should help give a massive boost to the whole industry.
In fact, early this year, the Trump's new company started selling different kinds of cryptocurrency, including the so-called Trump meme coin, which of course has a picture of Trump on it. All that generated billions of dollars in sales, much of it for the Trumps, although nobody knows exactly how much. But we do know from public reports that a company, this is getting complicated, I know, but I think this stuff is important. A company that's bought a huge amount of Trump's cryptocurrency is called Alt5. One of the board members of Alt5 is Eric Trump, one of Trump's sons, of course, and the chairman of the board of that company is the son of Trump's special Middle East envoy.
And by the way, we're basing all these reports on stories in the responsible media, the New York Times, Bloomberg, and so forth.
AP, The Guardian.
Meanwhile, another company called MGX has made billions of dollars worth of investments using the Trump family's new cryptocurrency. The Trumps will reportedly profit from those deals, although no one knows by how much.
Again?
And the MGX chairman is a member of the ruling family of the United Arab Emirates. And he's the UAE's chief of intelligence, their head of national security.
Okay, and we're almost ready to wrap up crypto, although there's much more to talk about. And don't forget that a few months ago, Trump announced that the 220 investors who bought the biggest amounts of his meme coins would get to have a private, intimate dinner with him.
Part of the controversy is that those buying into the dinner stayed largely anonymous to the public, known only...
In order to get on it, people had to be among the top purchasers of the Trump coin. We are talking about millions, if not tens of millions of dollars spent on the coin.
Okay, so here's the part where it seems like there's semi-clear evidence that Trump is adjusting policy based on all of this personal business. Trump's Securities and Exchange Commission has dropped many, if not most, of its cases against crypto companies, including one of the top investors at Trump's dinner. And it's also announced that under the Trump administration, it's not going to even regulate meme coins, right? By the way, Walt is smiling this whole time, like not very happy, but smiling.
Less than smiling, it was more of a primeval simian effort to bare my teeth. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly an example of how, even in the absence of direct evidence, there is so much circumstantial evidence and no attempt to hide it. This reaches a level of profiteering off of public office. You're not supposed to use public office for private gain, And in fact, the definition of corruption by Transparency International is the misuse of entrusted power for private gain. All of ethics rules in government are based on that simple principle, adding perhaps that you want to avoid even the appearance of doing so. Well, this guy is creating the appearance, and it certainly seems like the reality of generating private profit off of public office. And that goes back to the fundamental concern that in a republic, the government is supposed to exist to serve the people, not the leaders. We're not subjects of an omnipotent monarch. We're the citizens of what's supposed to be a free republic. And so this is a direct assault on democracy as much as it is corruption. And in fact, and I'm going to use the F word, fascism often comes hand in hand, invariably comes hand in hand with corruption. They're inextricably linked. And so we're seeing an aggrandizement of presidential power and an effort to create unlimited reach for whatever the president wants to do. At the same time, we're seeing him and his close allies financially benefiting. It's all one and the same.
So, Walt, give us some hypothetical scenarios, realistic scenarios, but hypothetical ones where these kinds of entanglements, whether the organizational entanglement or Trump's business dealings, could influence how he runs the government and how he makes decisions about foreign policy or domestic policy. Do you stay up late at night wondering, he could?
Well, I don't stay up late at night wondering. I stay up late at night feeling that I know that he's going to make decisions that are going to benefit him and not necessarily the American people.
This raises a question I've heard people say, all politicians are crooks. They resent politicians generally.
In fact, Dave, you spent a lot of time in Maine, and a lot of people in Maine, I think, have that view.
Yeah, I've heard this up here in Maine, where I am now. I've heard it on other places. It's a kind of symbol of alienation from the system, which I think does drive a lot of people into the arms of demagogues such as Trump. Because they don't really see a difference between him and Biden. Didn't see a difference, and that sort of thing. So, what do you say to people who make this argument? It's not really an argument; it's just a comment. All politicians are crooks.
So I don't agree with that. But what I do agree with is that all of our elected officials, at least collectively, have failed to set up the kind of ethics rules that give us any reason to have confidence in them. If you have a system that forces you to just trust their good nature, then if you're suspicious of human nature or have had examples of humans behaving badly in your life, then that's no ethics system at all. That's another kind of blind trust. The only thing that's blind is the citizen. They're blindly trusting the elected official to do whatever they want. And it's the same in the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Roberts was vigorously opposed to any kind of ethics rules for justices of the Supreme Court until Clarence Thomas's ethics scandals got too embarrassing and they were forced to pass this meaningless, absolutely watery ethics bill for members of the Supreme Court. And what you see is that these institutions are very good at creating rules for others. But then when it comes to them, they start whining about the inconvenience of ethics rules and how dare you judge us. And so people, in many senses, can't be trusted to rule themselves. And our elected officials and Supreme Court justices have failed miserably.
Well, James Madison said at the Constitutional Convention, all men having power should be distrusted to a certain degree. That's a rough paraphrase. He sure had it right. That's the reason you have checks and balances and divisions of power and so forth. And all of this discussion raises a really interesting question to me, and that is how much of ethics norms or laws are internalized or need to be internalized in the individual. When you were in this work, advising people in government, did you find that people fell along some kind of spectrum between those who got it, so to speak, who understood it almost intuitively when you raised a question or when they came to you with a question of, may I do this or that, versus at the other end of the spectrum, people who seem to be obtuse to it? And is there an internalization of ethics that plays a role, do you think, in this whole process?
I think absolutely. And I think that's a really insightful point. It was something that mattered to me a lot, and I was very conscious about when I was in the role of Director of the Office of Government Ethics. And in the 4.5 years that I held that job, that was actually one of the top priorities, was how do we create a culture to reinforce this already fairly apolitical culture, but how do we also ensure an ethical culture? And I had this belief that the ethics trainings the employees do matter, and to the extent that ethics officials could really get them to understand the rules and maybe the reason for the rules, we'd have increased compliance. And so we increased the amount of training. There was 1 year where the office only did a few trainings, and sometimes you'd have as few as 6 people sitting in the room. And by the time I was done, we were training, we had 7,500 attendances, at trainings. It may be the same people sometimes, but 7,500 enrollments in training that the Office of Government Ethics put on for the 4,500 ethics officials, who then went out and trained the 2.2 million federal employees. And so we focused on training the trainer, and we really tried to impart on them building a culture. Unfortunately, though, tone from the top matters. And so when you have President George W. Bush and President Obama saying they really care about government ethics, whatever other faults you have with both of them, they both sent that message, and it trickled down to the staff. It reinforced an existing culture. And then you have this president wantonly violating rules right and left, violating norms right and left, because there are no rules, and flaunting the corruption as a good thing. That is the tone then that is destroying, or has destroyed, the ethical culture.
I would really be interested in hearing you talk about other presidents a little bit. I mean, you served under Obama.
And Bush.
And Bush. How are they in this ethical area? I mean, we've talked a lot about Trump. Did you see ethical problems or misdeeds by Obama, Biden, Bush? Anything by the presidents themselves?
Well, they were much like the presidents who came before them ever since the Ethics in Government Act was passed. That law was passed in 1978 as a reaction to Nixon. And there's a document on OGE's website that talks about how presidents should attempt to eliminate their conflict of interests, even though they're not covered by the conflict of interest law. And it talks about how President Reagan and Nancy Reagan forfeited their royalties for TV, movies, and radio appearances over the years for the duration of his presidency. And so they had no ability to profit off of all of the TV channels running their old movies because he was currently the president.
Interesting.
The system pretty much worked with regard to those presidents. They had eliminated the kinds of conflicts of interest that would create scandals. There was some criticism of presidents selling books and making a profit off of that, and people accusing them of using their office for that. But you made a lot of Democrats angry, very angry at you, because you said some really tough, some would call them nasty things about Joe Biden, who many people consider, one of the most moral presidents. Well, I don't feel like any of it was nasty, but I did write an op-ed early in his administration in March where it had suddenly become clear that the standard was going to be, let's be better than Trump. And that's good. But that's an awfully low bar. I mean,
doesn't take much, right?
And just to clarify, the issues that you got really upset with Biden about were that the White House had hired children of people in the cabinet or people who were close to Biden, and you thought that smelled.
You know, one of Biden's closest top advisors had multiple children working in the government, and I think maybe one of them had been a career official, but certainly at least one, if not two, was hired as like a special intern type thing, I think at the Department of Treasury. Well, there are tens of thousands of young people who want those jobs. And we're supposed to believe coincidentally that person got the job, not because his dad was Biden's closest advisor, but because the Office of Presidential Personnel just thought he stood out from those tens of thousands of other applicants, and it's an absolute coincidence. Now, I truly believe that it's unlikely that the father ever did anything to influence the hiring process. But I also believe that the way the world works, just like I said with the countries, it doesn't matter. You know, somebody knew that this is something that the higher-ups would like to happen without them having to say so.
You got upset because of Hunter Biden, you know, whether or not he did anything illegal. It certainly looked like he was cashing in on his father's being president.
On the Hunter Biden thing, I personally think that Hunter Biden, profiting off of his father's presidency, selling the art, was gross. But he's a private...
Selling art for huge amounts of money, right? His own paintings, I guess, his own art.
For huge amounts of money. I find that gross, just really icky. But he's a private citizen, so my beef wasn't so much with him, but with the White House, because the White House intervened and negotiated a deal with the art dealer that the buyers would remain anonymous, and this would supposedly prevent any potential for corruption. But it is impossible to believe that Hunter Biden wasn't going to learn who bought the art. The problem with that deal is that the only thing then the administration ensured was that we wouldn't know who bought the art. Because the dealer knows, and odds are the artist is going to know, and chances are it's going to trickle up to the White House. But the deal ensured that we, the public, wouldn't know. And so I found that intervention highly objectionable. It probably was motivated by the best of desires to try to eliminate conflicts of interest. But it was so clumsy and haphazard that it had them thinking like lawyers instead of like human beings and saying, gee, let's think through who's really going to be the ones not knowing. Oh, the public.
But in any case, none of this even, I mean, it sounds quaint now compared to Trump's mega billion-dollar real estate deals and crypto deals.
Absolutely.
Walt, we're not going to solve the problem of Trump right now. So many terrible things are happening, and federal employees who are in the mid-level ranks and who've been there through multiple administrations are facing a real problem in many cases. What would you tell them? What advice would you give them about staying and fighting versus leaving and opening the vacancies to what will probably be extremist zealots who replace them?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. During that period when I was still serving in the role during the Trump administration, I had to keep asking myself, was I doing harm or doing good? And I came up with 3 questions that I asked myself literally every morning before I went to work to decide whether to continue working another day. I asked myself these 3 questions. 1, can I accomplish the mission of the agency that I'm here to accomplish? Number 2, can I do it ethically and morally? And number 3, can I do it without lying? And I think what's really important, particularly for attorneys in the government, because attorneys sometimes hide behind their role. They think, I'm making this argument because the client deserves zealous advocacy, and so I'm not really responsible for the words that come out of my mouth. Well, I'm here to tell them that this is your life. This is your short time on earth. And it is not someone else saying those words. It's you saying those words. And so if you ask yourself those 3 questions, there are clearly some things that you should have the morals or the values or the principles, whatever you want to call it, that is your red line you're not willing to cross. This is how you spent your life. This is what you chose to do with the time you were given on earth. And I don't care if it was your job any more than the prosecutors at Nuremberg were willing to accept I was just following orders.
Right.
So I think the answer is those three questions. Can you accomplish the mission? Can you do it morally and ethically? And can you do it without lying?
Wow, this is amazing. I didn't know most of this stuff. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Walter Shaub, who was the head of the Office of Government Ethics from 2013 to 2017 and has been working on these issues since. You know, one of the things that happens in a lot of our podcasts is that despite all the gloom that we seem to be reporting on, we find people who have light in this gloom, and you're one of them, and really, we really appreciate your being with us. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Thank you for that, and thank you for having me.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, or pretty much any leading podcast site. And we hope you'll check out more of our work at tworeporters.org. I'm David Tripler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.